I promised my confession, and here it is. Deep down, in the witching hour, I knew I would climb to the top of the tower on a pile of corpses, and we told them it was about soothing the world's pain. That's the biggest lie we told. You can't eliminate pain. There's no such thing as a painkiller. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you. I'm Matt.
I'm Mel,
And I'm Lisa.
and this is the No Fear Cast, a podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. We are back for episode 9 of season 8, our last episode in our series on Netflix's The Fall of the House of Usher. So join us as we watch the Ushers fall.
All right, we have reached the end of our discussion of the fall of the House of Usher. Now, I will go ahead and warn you, listeners, we're going to be discussing the last 2 episodes of the series. So, episode 7, which is The Pit and the Pendulum, and episode 8, The Raven. Now, because we don't want to turn this into a 10-part series, we're going to try to cover both of these episodes today. But I would just go ahead and tell you that there is so much packed in here that we want to talk about. And I know we're not going to get a chance, but we're going to do our best. We're going to try to hit the high points and talk about, of course, how everything is wrapping up. I know we want to talk about what is happening with the kind of ending of the family, a little bit more about Verna and who she is, because there's a lot revealed in these 2 episodes. And of course, we're going to talk about how all of this connects to Poe, just like we've been talking about throughout. So with that being said, The Pit and the Pendulum gets us to the last of Roderick Usher's children meeting his death. So in this case, it is his oldest son who gets it, for lack of a better word, in the end. Frederick. I will say, I mean, with something like The Pit and the Pendulum, you know how he's going to die. I think once you see the episode title, and it didn't disappoint. I mean, it was very straightforward, but it was one of those moments that I found enjoyable, if that's the right word, as a viewer. Just when you're anticipating something and then it's delivered, that's always really nice. So I'm sure we won't talk about that too much, but The Pit and the Pendulum, I feel like, is one of Poe's more well-known stories. But we do get a few flashbacks of what's been happening. We find out really what happened between Roderick and Dupin in the past that made them, because they started off as allies and even friends. They were going out to take down this corporation together, and then that's not what happens. And so we learned some of that, in particularly about, they're trying to take down the Fortunato company, and Roderick is supposed to be getting him these confidential documents. And then when it's his turn to testify, he doesn't do what he says he's going to do. He doesn't tell the truth, but instead he shows that he's kind of a team player with the business and ends up setting his path forward. And so we get some of that kind of played out for us there. We also see Frederick, before his death, really, I think, turn really kind of evil, especially towards his wife. I mean, that's really the only way I can describe him. His wife is well, she was in the hospital, and then he brought her home basically so he could torture her without any repercussions, which is kind of the point of all of the ushers. They're doing these terrible things without any accountability. Well, until Verna, of course. um, so I find it really interesting, kind of looking at. I guess maybe we start there with like that being the first point, because then we're going to have to talk about the two um, elder ushers and kind of how that story is ended, which really happens in episode 8. But this is the last of the children's death, and if I'm remembering right, it started with the youngest and went all the way up to the oldest. So it kind of, they were falling like dominoes in that way. But as we get closer to kind of quote unquote the real children, because we talked about that a little bit last time, about how really there were only two proper legitimate usher children, and the other ones had just kind of been brought in. They had different mothers. They weren't the result of like a marriage. Of course, Annabelle Lee, Roderick Usher's first wife, we see a lot of her in this episode in flashbacks. And, she's in many ways kind of the one good usher that we have from the beginning. Of course, we're going to talk about his granddaughter later too, because a lot of people compare her to Annabelle Lee and how she's good as well. But one thing I noticed, especially as we were kind of getting into Frederick's death, is that the closer the children were to the center of this dynasty, so like the two, I guess, original children. I can't think of a good word for that. But almost you really see, I think, the corruptness that is there. Like in the beginning, when we were watching, like Perry's death, Prospero's death, and that very first, that death was a hard one to watch. But in many ways, like he was just kind of greedy, right? Like he just wanted to make money. He just wanted to make his name. There there was something so much more sinister than just like a money grab that I think was happening within Frederick. And I think that was part of being so close to the ushers for his entire life. So I don't know. I'm curious to hear, Matt and Mel, your thoughts on, episode 7 in particular, because we'll talk about episode 8 later, if that makes sense. But yeah, I guess we'll talk about the last of the Usher children meeting his doom in this episode.
I hate to say that I enjoyed his demise. That just is, I don't know. I don't have that kind of Schadenfreude, but I really enjoyed these two episodes, and I'm going to try to separate them, like you said, into right now just episode 7, but they do play into each other pretty well. So one thing that I thought was really fascinating, and we can probably talk more in depth about this. This is the first time that we've really seen Verna express actual emotion at the death of one of the Usher children. Up till now, she seemed like sort of an impassionate, almost force of nature. And to see her reaction to how Freddie tortured his wife, basically. I mean, she basically says to him that, you know, I normally don't take such a heavy hand in this, but I'm going to do it for you. And it's because of the pliers. And if you haven't seen the episode yet, first of all, what are you doing? You spoilers everywhere here in this episode, but also, like, it's she actually shows like true vengeance, like rage-filled vengeance at him for how he treated his wife. And I found that really fascinating because we see it again in the final episode as well. And like I don't know, I think there's a lot more to talk about, but I'm gonna give it over to Mel and let her jump in with her reaction.
Yeah, Matt, I agree with you that these last two episodes were really good. I particularly liked episode 8. I thought the way that it was all drawn together was really, really well done and a great homage to Poe. And I was a fan of the Verna character and her kind of just really interesting weirdness throughout it. So these two episodes giving us more about her was really interesting to me. But like you said, we should probably focus on the pit and the pendulum. And so I just want to kind of respond to what you guys are saying. I think you guys are right that the cruelty, or I guess the horribleness of the kids is all over the place because they've been manipulated, and grown up under certain circumstances. But I think you guys are right that Freddie and Tamerlane kind of bore the brunt, being the first two kids, who had the potential with with a mother like Annabelle, but then ended up, you know, I think I think it's in episode 7 when Roderick tells Dupin that he worked to basically steal the children away from Annabelle. Like there was like a custody agreement, and then he kind of used his money to buy them. And I'm not gonna get too much in episode 8, but we see in episode 8 when he confronts Annabelle's ghost that she makes the argument that the kids died as soon as his influence was in their lives because they couldn't be their own people anymore, have their own personalities. And there's this moment before Freddy does the torturing with the teeth, which of course is a little kind of callback to Poe's Bernice with the man who takes all of his wife's teeth out, removes them all, where Freddy basically tells Morella that part of the reason he is the way he is because of the father, which is no excuse, and he's just despicable at that point. So you have no sympathy for him like we have other people. But he says this, I don't think I wrote down the exact quote, but he says the reason he's going to do this is because his father taught him that you should not be consistently cruel. You should be brutal once. And then that would like fix everything because people wouldn't challenge you anymore, which is a really just depressing and horrible way of looking at life. But it got me thinking that Freddie was casually and consistently cruel throughout the whole thing. I think we talked about this last time where he and Tamerlane in particular were just horrible to the other kids. And um, it's kind of like his pettiness just keeps fueling his cruelness to new heights, I guess. And he's basically unraveling and just completely falling apart at the end. And Matt, I agree with you that it was really interesting the way Verna reacted to his death. Of course, we also know too that she's just had a kind of showdown with Madeline, who I thought was a really fascinating character in these last two episodes. After I noted last time the way she treated Tamerlane. But yeah, Verna, like you said, Matt, is basically like, once you did this terrible thing, then your death had to go in this direction. And once again, like she did with Perry, she's like, if you hadn't done these things, I might have just let you get hit by a bus or have a heart attack or die in your sleep. And so we see that fact that Verna has her own. She has to do this, but the way in which she pursues it is kind of tailored for each kid. And I think that Freddy's is the most torturous and the most calculated for brutality because that was where he had ended up. It was almost like her punishments are pun for Tamerlane mirrors in which they kind of see their messed up lives. So yeah, um, I really think the way that Verna treated him and how she talked to him in a way that was different from the end point with the other kids was really fascinating. It was kind of the cap on the end of the children and what Roderick had done to his own family.
Yeah, I agree. And there's there's a couple of places where we could go here because you did bring up Madeline Usher, which would bring us into, I think, episode 8, or we could kind of talk about them both at the same time, but kind of introduce 8 as well, because once the children are gone, it's Madeline and Roderick who we're focusing on at this point, and we learn a lot about them and about their past in particular, which I think is really fascinating to me. Madeline, just as a character, is intriguing. I sometimes wonder what she would have done had she been able to be fully in charge. And I think you brought this up before, Mel, but just the fact that even given the time period, when we have the flashbacks of when they were younger, so you're talking about like, right around into the 70s, beginning of the 80s, when we're kind of really getting to know them. Um, and her anticipating, I guess, her interest in AI, which of course comes into play at the very end as well. But um, just her interest in like computers and algorithms, and but she's also we see her being a very shrewd character. I don't know if that's the word I'm looking for. She definitely seems to be the one who is there pushing her brother to make certain choices and to do certain things. I don't want to call her the anti Annabelle Lee, because I don't like pitting like women characters against each other, but at certain times they kind of felt that way, like they were poised to. It was like the devil on the shoulder and the angel on the shoulder, like, and she ended up being the one who pulled her brother down kind of the path of darkness. And then we also learn about the pact with Verna, which to me, she seemed to be really driving that. Even though like her brother was there making those decisions with her. Um, she seemed to be the one to be leading that. I don't know. I do want to take a moment though before we really get into talking about Madeline and her brother and like the intricacies of that relationship and what they've done in the past. I want to talk a little bit about Rufus Griswold, because I found I got just an endless amount of joy watching that storyline play out, because I mean, it's obvious when he's introduced. Like, Rufus Griswold is the boss at Fortunato. He's the one that is is being, I don't know why words aren't coming to me tonight. I apologize, listeners, but I mean, for lack of a better word, like, he's just mean. I mean, he's out for himself. He's greedy. He's everything that they seem to want to take down Roderick and Madeline, especially when he like introduces like ways that that can things that can benefit the company, and then he steals the idea and like makes it clear that he's gonna use him, but like he's not gonna give him what he's worth. And he's very intrigued by Madeline too when he talks to her, but it's also very clear that he's just kind of like, you're a woman, so what am I supposed to do? Like, I can't, it's not like I can hire and promote you. Like, that's the vibe that we get from this guy. Greedy, misogynistic, opportunistic, um just an all around kind of corporate a-hole from the beginning. But the fun thing that I really found, of course, we get to see him get his just desserts, I guess, at the end. Because with Poe, somebody's going to be buried behind a wall, and they were kind of teasing that the whole series. Roderick staring at a wall and hearing the jester bells throughout. And if you know the story, the Cask of Amontillado, which, like the Pit and the Pendulum, that's another one that's a very famous, well-known, well-read Poe story. But the thing that I thought was so fun is that Rufus Griswold was named after a real man who was alive during Poe's time. He was a literary critic. He was an editor. And he worked with Poe kind of throughout his life, but they had a very contentious, like, I don't even know if you'd call it a friendship, but they had a very contentious relationship. Just, if I'm going to boil it down, listeners, you can look it up because there's too much to cover if you want to look it up and read into it. But I mean, Griswold published Poe's poetry several times, but he also replaced Poe at one point when Poe had resigned from a magazine, and he was paid a higher salary. And then he also, Griswold didn't have very nice things to say about his stories or his poetry, and he tended to, hold up other poets like Longfellow that Poe didn't like, but they would reconcile every once in a while and kind of be friends, kind of. I'm using air quotes, you can't see that, but um I guess kind of the nail in the coffin of their contentious relationship was after Poe had died, and Griswold was one of the first people to publish an obituary, and he basically called Poe a madman in it. I mean, you can read his obituary online. It comes across as catty, and it sets forth like a lot of lies that people still believe about Poe to this day. And I don't know. It was just, let's just say it was a messy relationship. And to have him be kind of such a jerk in the show, but then also to meet this kind of demise and be drunkenly walled up basically in a Poe story felt like justice to me in some sort of weird way. So yeah, I just wanted to point that out. And of course that is the impetus that starts the whole Verna thing, because she's offering them a way out of this. She's like, I know you did something, you committed a crime, I know you killed somebody, I know you're looking to get away with it, and I can ensure that you get away with it. So that's how she lays out um the offer to them. But I just found that little detail made me so happy.
Well, I want to go back to what you were saying about Madeline and Roderick, and I'm going to do that vis-a-vis Rufus Griswold, actually, or at least I believe he was the one that said it. But I want to offer a different interpretation of them, because you mentioned that Roderick seemed to be more reticent and was being kind of pushed into it by Madeline, and I do agree, but I feel like a lot of the way that they were acting as sort of do-gooders and wanting to take down people like Griswold was actually an act, because, and I wish I wrote it down. I don't remember who said it. I thought it was Griswold, but one of the characters tells them that they viewed Fortunato as their birthright because they are the bastard children of the owner, or I guess the illegitimate children, if you prefer, of the original like owner, CEO, whatever. And I don't like. I wonder if maybe all along, maybe Roderick was a little more hesitant than Madeline. She definitely did have like this Lady Macbeth kind of coldness to her as far as how to get what she wants. But at the same time, I don't think Roderick was as tormented as he seems to be, because even like yes, Annabelle Lee is this like angel on his shoulder, so to speak, but after he does like double crosses Dupin, he's pretty much remorseless to her. Like even at that point, he's like, well, I just wish you hadn't been there, basically. Like, but he doesn't have a crisis of consciousness over it. And I think it goes back to the quote that we used for the opening, that he said that deep down in the witching hour he knew that he would climb to the top on a pile of corpses. So like I wonder if it they both are like a way to read them would be that they both are ruthless, emotionless, and both pretty willingly sold out their entire bloodline for a chance to get away with the murder of Griswold. And even at the end, when Verna forces them to agree, since they're not doing a blood pact, they're drinking or whatever. Madeline seems to be the one who hesitates just slightly. Like Roderick immediately is like, "Okay, yes, I agree. I don't care about my bloodline. Um, let him die off." And Madeline sort of hesitates slightly before she agrees. So I don't know. I just wanted to throw that out as another way to interpret it, that maybe they are both ruthless, cold, and emotionless in going after what they perceive to be theirs, the Fortunato Empire.
Which you remind me of that line when he's so willingly says he's going to take that deal, because he has little children at that point, doesn't he? Like the children
Yes.
are
Oh
around.
yeah, Frederick Tamerlane's an infant, and Frederick is the toddler with the siren, the fire truck thing.
Right, right. Which that was one of those moments that it was like ice running through my veins. I was just like, oh my gosh. The fact, because you're right, Madeline did, kind of hesitate, because I think she knew what it meant. But then they justify it, like Verna justifies it by I think it's Verna, but when they're having that discussion, they basically justify it as like, well, is it really so bad to have your bloodline die off if you know that they're going to have like a good life? Meaning, if you know like everything's going to be handed to them and they're going to have it easy, versus they could continue on, but it's going to be, a life of toil and a life of hardship and a life of, having other people like Rufus, uh, basically keeping them down the whole time. But that felt like a justification after that point, because you're right, he does very willingly say, "Nope, that's fine. That good with me."
And not only is it a justification on Roderick's part, but I almost dare say that Verna, the way she phrases it, and exactly the way you said of how this deal will have your children set for their lives and they will live like full lives and you will live longer than any other Usher man has lived, blah 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 blah. Um, and in particular, my ears perked up at that life of toil thing, because going back to Freddie's death, one of the things Verna says to him, because she appears to have knowledge of not just the future, but also how this would have played out if Roderick and Madeline had not accepted the deal at all. And she says something, I don't remember the exact wording, but basically like that the irony is that in the other life, he was a dentist. And so when we get that reveal of it, your kids won't have to work a life of toil and that sort of thing. I'm pretty sure a dentist lives pretty well. I mean, they're not Jeff Bezos level rich, but I mean, a dentist is not 750 an hour, working hard, toiling manual labor or something. I mean, that's a pretty good living, even by like rich standards, or I guess upper middle class standards. So I feel like Verna was kind of maybe putting her thumb on the scale a little in her phrasing of things. I still think Madeline and Roderick willingly walked through that door without much hesitation at all. But I do think that, the phrasing during the sealing of the deal, I mean, she was kind of nudging them towards it.
Oh yeah, and I mean, and she even I didn't write down the exact quote, but she says it. I wrote down, is this like some kind of experiment for her? Because she calls herself a witness and something. She reminds me of those creatures in horror and in folklore that are ambivalent toward humans, and they can show up and do something good to you, or show up and do something terrible to you. They don't care. There's like this idea of like this disconnect, but it almost seems like she's curious about humans in a way. And she made some sort of comment that, you can, what was it, you can create a charity and do all sorts of good, or you can do terrible things, you can continue to do terrible things, like, this murder you committed. And she's like, I just want to see what you do. And she's acting like she's a disinterested observer, but I think, Matt, you're right. Like, there's a curiosity to her that she is pushing their buttons and she is trying to get them, but she doesn't have to push too hard. I like the way you said Madrick there for a second, because they pretty much are like one being, just an extent in some ways, but also not. Um, but yeah, I feel like Verna is like a trickster figure, and to her it's just interesting to see what they do. And it's not like she thinks they're probably going to do bad things, but she's like, you do whatever you want. Like, she still claims she's offering them free will. So yeah, I definitely think she's a really interesting like trickster salesperson. But the fact that they jump at it the way they do, especially Roderick, and damning these two children that he already has, is just, and then going and finding the other children that he's had and bringing them to him, even though he knows it's like a death knell for them. is just horrifying. One other thing I was thinking about, and this is just an interpretation of a person watching it. I mean, I don't know that I have a huge amount of evidence for this, but I thought Madeline was kind of reticent and followed Roderick's lead throughout the whole bargaining. And by the end, we have this idea that Madeline believes that Verna is like a creepy supernatural threat before Roderick really is like, yeah, he just kind of dismissed it all, supposedly. Um, I saw that moment. I mean, I do think Madeline realizes what's going on. Madeline takes precautions to not have a line to die, which two people you would think they'd want a legacy. Why would you want your kids all to die right before you do? But that's, they're so obsessed with themselves. But yeah, she hesitates. And at one point, Verna says, because Madeline basically says that the pact is that when Roderick dies, everybody dies right before him. And it's almost like she thinks that Roderick is making the deal and not necessarily her. Because Verna actually says at one point, you have to agree to, you're in, what is it? You come into the pack together and you go out of the pack together. Come in the world together, go out of the world together. And I think it's pretty clear that Madeline always kind of believed the pact was with Roderick and that she could beat it. Because when she goes and tries to find Verna and confronts her, Verna tells Roderick later when she brings him back to life that Madeline was trying to loophole her. And Madeline she's bargaining. She makes herself CEO. She basically she gets Roderick to commit suicide, which is kind of means basically murdering him. Like she's doing everything she can to protect herself and get herself the power, because there's this weird thought in her mind that she was on the margins of the pact or something. And Verna even tells her in the house again, like, you cannot renegotiate the deal. Because I think Madeline even mentioned something like Roderick made the deal. And she's like, no, I told you it was the two of you together, no matter what. And so even up until the end, I think that Madeline is holding on to this idea that because she wasn't as assertive in the making of the pact, that maybe she could skirt it somehow. And so, yeah, there's an idea that she's the wizard behind the curtain for Roderick, because she talks about how he always trusted her and they're the king and the queen and all that jazz at the end. But I think there's also this idea too that like Roderick said, he knew the whole time, and he knew, even though he was answering for both of them, that it tied her into it. Because he knows that if he kills himself, it doesn't stop anything. Like, everybody still has to die.
I did find it fascinating that Madeline tried to renegotiate the terms of her deal. And I wonder if she felt like she was on the edge of that deal. I think a lot of it was because essentially she knew that the Usher line had already died out. Like, once the children were dead and once her brother was going to be dead, like, because she didn't have any kids and she, is beyond the point of being able to have them, I guess, at that point. I wonder if she felt like that was a loophole where she could get out of the kind of pack. But of course, there is no out, and that's Verna's whole point. I'm really interested, Mel, in what you were saying about Verna, because I feel like we need to spend this part of the of this episode discussing Verna a little bit more in depth. You described her as a trickster character, and I know she's supposed to be, I mean, she's the Raven essentially in this, but I mean, because she is the one who gets the last word and who, gets to say nevermore, right? She's the one who, I guess, metaphorically is making sure that this won't happen again, because at least not with the Ushers, because it can't. She's taking care of that. But it still kind of bothers me. Like, early on in the show, I wondered if she wasn't a death character, a kind of grim reaper. Then I quickly changed my mind from that. I think trickster, like a trickster character, is probably one of the best things. Because there's no sense of like, I don't know, I guess in like a Christian worldview, you might even call her like a demon, like, making this kind of selling your soul type of thing. But it doesn't have that kind of religious overtones to it. So she's still, I think, but I don't know, she does have the scales a little bit, right? Like she is passing judgment, especially in the way she brings about death. Like with Frederick, I think you were right that we did see her exhibit more emotion than just pure curiosity or like I'm going to watch this game play out. But we almost see compassion because we're going to have to talk about this too because the whole time I was watching episode 8, I remember thinking, "Oh, okay, like we've gotten to the end of the children and then so the bloodline is done." And then I remember, no, there's a granddaughter, right? And so I knew watching the last episode, like she was gonna have to go after Lenore at some point. And she does, but it's a completely different way. She she does take her painlessly. She does seem to exhibit some sort of compassion. And it reminds me of some of the other deaths where she does kind of remind them that it doesn't have to be this hard. Like they're creating these really violent deaths for themselves based on their own actions. Like they're going to die no matter what, but how they die is kind of up to them. So I do find that a little bit fascinating that like she at any point could have intervened and just taken them in a painless way, which is, a little bit ironic considering what the family, how they got their wealth was creating this lie around painkillers. But I don't know, like she's really an enigma to me. And the fact that she probably crossed paths with Pym at some point prior to ever meeting the Ushers. I mean, I know she's like exists somewhere out of time. So like did when Pym met with her early on, did that set her on the scent of the Ushers, or did she deliberately go find him because she knew he would be part of the Ushers later, like part of their story? I don't know.
I got the impression she said she was standing on the ice and saw Pym and he knew that was an impossible thing. I got the impression it was because she followed his expedition because she knew it was a bunch of rich, uninhibited people and she lists off all the sins and crimes that they committed. I thought it was more of her like being a witness, but then she saw Pym. I didn't. That's interesting. I didn't really think of that as connecting her to the Ushers. I thought of it more as like Pym just happened to be with Usher like people and she was observing, which that's also an
Well,
interesting conversation because she says at one point something about going topside as if she's like from hell or something.
right. And that
Yeah.
that was what that's one of the things that kind of my brain has been rolling around because like we know at that point, and Pym did unspeakable things on that boat, right? I mean, we even laughed about it, which we didn't talk about it, which was in episode 5 or 6. Mel, you were the one who brought it up when said he was having oh god, what's his name?
Richard Parker.
Richard Parker. I almost said Richard Adams, and I was like, that's not right. When he says having Richard Parker for dinner, which is a reference to the novel, and there's cannibalism, and yeah. I mean, he obviously did unspeakable things, as did like everybody on that expedition. So yeah, I can see because we know from looking through those historical pictures where she's with all these like very prominent families and these very prominent men, these very powerful men all throughout kind of history. So there's something about that she's attracted to, but this is what got me. I had assumed when she was with some of the previous like powerful men doing unspeakable things, she was offering them the same kind of deal that she did the Ushers. Like, I will, or something similar. Maybe I won't end your bloodline, but I'll give you some sort of immunity to the terrible things you're doing, but you're going to have to give me this in return. But with the Pym expedition, I don't think she did, because she offers Pym, like, she makes Pym the deal later. Basically, when she says, I can offer you the same thing and make sure you don't, because she's like, you're not an usher, you're going to take the fall for what they've been doing. And he ends up saying, no, I'm okay with that. And we see him going to jail later. But she essentially laid it out for him and was like, no, I can make that go away too. So that makes me think she didn't offer the people on the boat like that kind of deal. So was she just bearing witness? I don't know. Is that her, like, does she do that sometime? Does she just watch and observe? Or is she always kind of somehow making some sort of deal with these kind of people, and that's how they're getting this? I don't know.
I think that's the beauty of her character, though, is that she's so ambiguous. I mean, she gets the last word where she says the mystery of mysteries. And I mean, even when I use, as I mentioned, I use the word trickster loosely because she doesn't completely fulfill that idea either. She's immortal. She's outside space and time. She has some sort of omniscience. I feel like she's not overly religious, but I feel like she's been interpreted religiously throughout the years when she describes to Roderick and Madeline how she's made bargains with people. She sees a kindred spirit in Pym, which is kind of disturbing. But at the same time, she still has that idea of the reckoning and like testing people. But I think when you said they reap what they sow, like they create their own deaths in a weird way. Yes, they're fated and damned from the very beginning, which is horrifying. But they still, as she points out, take themselves there, I guess. I think, yeah, there's a lot of nettly questions about fate and free will and what Verna is. She's just so complicated. But I'm not sure that how she talks to Lenore is that different from how she talks to anybody else. Everybody else put themselves in the position that they're in. And Lenore is the best. Lenore is, the innocent one. And Verna even says at one point that they make the bargain. She doesn't. And she said nobody ever thinks about the bargain they're making. Like, no, like basically she's saying, Madeline and Roderick jumped at this, not ever thinking that Lenore would exist, which I don't know what Madeline feels about Lenore because she turned her into a bot. But Roderick seems to love Lenore because she reminds him of Annabelle. And I wish I had that quote, but basically, yeah, I mean, Verna is basically saying like humans, because she always talks about us as if we're other, so she's not human. Throughout time, even when they started civilizations, always make these bargains without thinking. Like it's not even fine print. They don't even listen to what she's actually saying, and then she is bound, just like them, to commit the death of the person. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, I think you see her kind of her own, I guess, troubled. What's the word I'm looking for? Like, not conscience, but that's the word I keep coming back to. Like, she's bound. They did this. It's not necessarily her fault per se. They could have gotten out of it, and she has to be the one to complete the bargain, regardless of how that happens. Um, so yeah, I kind of feel like, she is the reckoning, and she can't necessarily discriminate amongst them all. She has to do what she was sworn to do in the bargain. And it's in her mind, it's Madeline and Roderick that did this because she's literally like a higher being of some sort that we're just like little ants to. So I'm not even sure how we can ascribe I don't know how we can not make her ambiguous because we can't I think the point is that we could never comprehend her. And that's how she does the things that she does. And that's why it's not explained who she is.
Yeah. Yeah, we can't explain her, which is fun for this kind of story. And I will say that there was that one little line that she said about, when she's offering up these deals, and she says that, as I told one of my clients, they could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and nobody would do anything. And I thought that was a nice little reference to Trump during his 2016 election. There was a lot of little, I mean, horror has always been political, but there was a lot of, I think, nice, not just Poe references, but just kind of political jabs and undertones of just kind of a theme of eat the rich throughout this that I really enjoyed. But we're almost out of time. I feel like we've got to talk about the ending. Of course, Madeline in the basement. Is she dead? Is she not? There are noises. You can't have the fall of the House of Usher without having somebody come back from the dead. And I thought it was such a nice bookmark, bookend. That's the word I'm looking for. To what we got in the beginning with the mother coming back in that very house where they thought they had buried her and she came back. So I thought that entire sequence was incredibly, even though I knew what was coming, it was incredibly tense. It was scary. I thought it was really well done. Just watching it was just a really good episode of television.
Yeah, Lisa, I'm not sure what else we can add. I mean, the story of the fall of the House of Usher ends with Roderick not sure whether he buried his sister alive or dead, and she comes back and takes him out. And again, here we have Roderick not sure whether Madeline is alive or dead, though pretty sure that she's alive because she keeps moving around down there, and she comes back and ends him. And of course, the house falls down on them during a storm. And we have our Raven of Reckoning as Verna is on top of the demolished building, and we have our narrator in the form of Dupin who escapes. Like, he gets out of the house as it's falling. So I really like this kind of contemporary adaptation or retelling that was still pretty close to the story, and it worked perfectly. And like you said too, Lisa, it's full circle from the beginning with their mom, and it's also full circle of all the little throughout not every episode, but throughout the show, we got little hints as to what was going to happen to her. So I wasn't that surprised when it happened. I guess the only thing I would mention is just to play off what you're talking about, the kind of eat the rich theme. We have Madeline, gets to really just have her Lady Macbeth like chew the scenery moment, where even though she's kind of stabbed Roderick in the back already and even tried to kill him, they're having a drink together, which is how he turns the tables and tries to take her out. But she has this long speech where she basically, Roderick admits everything, and he shows a little bit of pain for what they had done, a little bit throughout the episodes, but he's haunted and being forced to feel this. She, on the other hand, is just like, blame the consumer. People are dumb. They want to be unsafe. They want these things, and we provide it for them, and we made money, so we're smart. And she basically just kind of like continues to just justify everything that they've done, and everything that they've chosen. So I thought that was an interesting way to end it. There were just so many things at the very end that were the perfect kind of end or development of all the traces that had come before. And then, listeners, if you have watched the episode, that there's a kind of epilogue where we see that the folks who were ushers but not related by blood, Juno and Morella, survive and end up doing the good things that Verna predicted that they would do. So the usher legacy ends up being outsiders using it for charitable purposes and to help the people that the ushers hurt. So you definitely have that in full circle as well. So I think with that, we're pretty much done with our tour of the House of Usher here and Flanagan's interpretation of it. We are at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram, and we have a Facebook page. Our email is nofearcast@gmail.com. If you like what we're doing, please consider supporting us on Patreon. We have shorter mini episodes there. We're not producing new ones at this point, but we have a kind of back catalog of them there that you can listen to. Or you can simply rate and review us in your podcatcher of choice, which is entirely free and helps other listeners find us. Theme music by Nicholas Gasparini. We will be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.